We are embarking this morning on a new study in the book of Joshua. The book of Joshua, which will take us, like I said, to the end of June. And because I'm not capable of doing one introduction, we will do two introductory talks. Otherwise, Derek Ewan would be extremely disappointed in me. And so, not to disappoint Derek, we will have two introductions. This morning will be the real introduction to Joshua, where we'll look at kind of the history from Genesis 1 to Joshua. That will be in an extremely clipped 8-minute pace, probably covering the first 5 books of the Bible, which we've done and do probably on an annual basis here. And then we'll turn more to kind of Joshua's history as he comes out in the Torah. And then next week, we're going to have a very, very difficult conversation. I don't think I'm looking forward to it. I will probably pass out when I'm done, but it's a conversation I think we need to have about the book of Joshua. Joshua has some very difficult things to digest. Greatest among them, and perhaps greatest anywhere in Scripture to digest, is something that scholars like to refer to as the ban. The Hebrew word is harim. It's a heavy, heavy word where it appears God is endorsing genocide. And so when you look at this word and you look at the things that take place in Joshua, the murdering of women and children, the complete annihilation of towns, God doesn't come out real well, to say the least. In fact, I think it is the single, possibly, as I've read, greatest stumbling block for people when it comes to understanding Christianity, God, and the Bible. So that will be our topic next week. Genocide, for or against. We will hold that till later. So let's begin to do the lighter study, which is kind of the history of Joshua. Like I said, we'll run rapidly through the first 5 books of the Bible. And if you are listening to this message, which many, many do over the internet, you will want to pull up the PowerPoint because otherwise it will be even harder to follow. In the first 5 years, we taught really the entirety of Scripture, the entirety of this story, and at times would retell the whole story. And as you recall, if you've been here for that, the Bible really, the story of God is a play. It's a real play, but it's a play that's been played out over millennia. And to really grasp that, we look at the Bible not as a bunch of little faith stories, not as a bunch of verses. In fact, I would make a very strong statement to say if you're just reading a verse and not understanding where it fits, you're really in big trouble. Because the Bible is not a verse. The Bible is a story. And each book of the Bible and chapter after chapter make up that story. And so the way we break this down is it is multiple acts, A-C-T-S, within the play. And within each act there are multiple scenes, and we'll run through those very rapidly. The first act is the first 11 chapters of Genesis, and it's broken up of some 5 different scenes: creation, the fall, Cain's sin, the flood, and the Tower of Babel. And the only thing I want to highlight in that opening scene, besides the fact that it is ugly, is just how ugly. What's fascinating that we studied was about 350 years after the flood, Noah and his kids are almost certainly still alive. It's a possibility that Abraham had already been born. The Tower of Babel, you find that things have gone to hell in a handbasket all over again. It took only 350 years for everything to actually just completely go down the toilet all over. And what we see in that is how utterly autonomous mankind is. How much we just push God out of our life, the very core of who we are, and our relationship with Him, and desire to live life on our own. And God quickly moves in chapter 12 to the second act, which I affectionately refer to as the building of a nation. And in chapter 12, we see what God does. He decides, in His infinite wisdom, to choose one man, and through that man, Abraham, in Genesis 12, to build a nation. And then that nation is supposed to then reach the world to save the world and turn this ugliness of the first 11 chapters back upright. And this is a very long act in the play. It runs all the way from Genesis 12 through the middle of 1 Kings, and it has 11 distinct scenes, if you will, at least the way I break it up. And in this first scene, we have what I call the patriarchs, or the founding fathers, where you start with one man. It doesn't look much like a nation. You go from Abraham to his son Isaac, one man still, to his son Jacob, one man still. And that leads us then into the following scenes. So then what does God need to do to fulfill this promise? He promises Abraham, I'm going to build a nation out of you to reach the world. So what does God need to fulfill through Abraham to pull this off, to turn life around? Well, first of all, you have to have a nation. He's one guy. Second of all, that nation needs somewhere to live. They need land. Third of all, they need a priesthood. Why would they need a priesthood? They need a priesthood within that nation to then teach the rest of that nation how to reach the world and live for God. It's really the same paradigm here. I'm the lead teaching pastor. Tim Brady, the pastor for the youth and the church. And we have teaching elders. And really, it's a priesthood, if you will. It's a model that comes out of the synagogue. And really, my role in particular as a priest is to then disseminate the Word of God and the story such that you grasp the story, such that you then can go on God's behalf and be His representative. That's exactly what God needs to do with this nation, to build a priesthood. He also, number 4, he needs prophets. He needs people that actually will speak on God's behalf. Somebody that God can whisper something to that can then be explained. And lastly, they need an identity. In America, we may fight a lot, and we do. And by the way, is there anything else besides the election going on in the entire world? I mean, Syrians are being slaughtered by the tens of thousands, and I haven't heard about them in months. It's just disgusting to me, the imbalance we have. But anyway, enough on that. But we have a constitution. It defines for us who we are. Well, God's nation would need that. They would need a constitution, if you will, and it's known as Torah. The one thing that they already have is a king, and their king is God. So in Genesis 12, God picks this man Abraham. He tells him to do 3 things. Leave your country, leave your relatives, and leave your father's house. He's 75 years old. This is roughly 4,000 years ago. And he tells them to move and go down, and eventually I'm going to build a nation out of you and place them in this land, and we're going to start this thing over and reach the world. This hike, if you will, as we call it, that Abraham makes, moving west and south, literally sets in motion the bringing of Messiah Jesus to us. It's that significant. This brings us to the second scene, which is around Genesis 30, where we move from one guy, Abraham, and then Isaac, and then Jacob, to then a set of tribes where Jacob has his 12 sons, where it's beginning to grow. We did this massive study on Jacob and Joshua this last year, the last 6 months of last year, where we studied this, and we saw what happened. Joseph gets sold. He goes down to Egypt. He rises to the second in command. A big famine hits. All 70 of the members of Jacob's household move down into Egypt. They get reconvened, and there they are, and they're being saved through that. And Jacob, God tells him before he dies, first of all, you're going to die here. This is as far as you're going to go. And you're also going to be here a long time. And so this leads us into the third scene, which is really not even written about. It's really between the books of Genesis and Exodus, where God begins to now form a people group, where they move from one man, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, to a set of tribes, the 12 tribes of Egypt, to really more of what we would call a people group or a nation. And there's a good side to this and a bad side to this. The good side is they have a lot of people. Some scholars estimate upwards of 2 million, and there's a ton of debate on that, none of which I am in the least bit interested in. The bad news is that they're enslaved by the Egyptians, which leads us to scene number 4, and this really is where we enter into the book of Exodus, where they choose a leader in Moses, and God chooses this man to begin to lead his people and lead them out. Moses, it just so happens, is the first of the great prophets. So it's fascinating. God is now beginning to fulfill these promises one by one. It leads to the next scene in Act 2, the deliverance of Israel through Moses. And you know the whole deal with Pharaoh, let my people go. He won't let the people go. He keeps making the work tougher and tougher. Then God unleashes 10 plagues. They match the 10 gods of Egypt. So one by one, God is thwarting each god. And finally, it's the firstborn of each household dies. The Israelite babies are saved because you know what happens. They inaugurate Passover. They take a perfect lamb. They slaughter the lamb. They take the blood. They wipe it over the doorpost. The angel of death passes over on this particular night, sees the blood over the doorpost. It's a foreshadowing of Jesus, whose blood has been written on our hearts, and so the angel of death passes over us as well. An amazing scene. He parts the Red Sea. They go through the Red Sea. They get out the other side. The sea collapses on the Egyptians, and then they go down into the Sinai desert, which is the sixth scene in the Torah, or the giving of the Torah. Moses goes up on the mountain, and God begins to disseminate what we like to affectionately call the Ten Commandments. But really, he disseminates the entire Torah to Moses. Not just the commandments, but the retelling of the story to God. So look what God has done now. He brings them to Sinai, and he's forming this group. And he tells them something significant. It says this, Moses went up to God, and this is in Exodus 19. And the Lord called him on the mountain and saying, thus you shall say to the house of Jacob, tell the sons of Israel, you yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians, how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now then, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my commandment, here it is, then you shall be my own possession among all the peoples. For all the earth is mine. And key phrase, and you shall be now a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. You see what God is doing. God is accomplishing one by one exactly what needs to take place to build this nation to then now reach the world. He's built a nation, right? They have a constitution in the Torah. They have a prophet in Moses, and more prophets will come. They have a priesthood within Israel, the Levites, the one tribe serving the other 11. And then all of the other 11 tribes are now priests to the world. God is building this piece by piece. What is missing? The land. It's the one thing that has not taken place yet. And by the way, all of this is covered in the books of Exodus and Leviticus. So now that covers Genesis, Exodus, and Leviticus. So we at least know what 3 books of the Bible are about. And then we have what I affectionately refer to as the grand delay, or the great pause, if you will. And you know what happens? The Israelites keep sinning over and over, and finally God has just had it. They're out in the desert, and he basically says, none of these people are entering into the promised land. There's no way I'm letting these people in. So he basically just has them wander in a circle for 40 years until they all die off. You know, to me, there was probably one old lady that was just holding on. You know what I mean? And they're like, come on, lady, drop. You know, we can go to the land as soon as you... That probably sounded cold, but you know there was one left. She finally dies, and they get to enter. And this is what we really see in the 2 books, the final 2 books of the Torah, the book of Numbers and Deuteronomy. The book of Numbers is horribly translated as far as the name goes. It literally means the wanderings. It has nothing to do about Numbers. It means the wandering. And really, this is the recounting of the story of the Israelites wandering for 40 years. And then the book of Deuteronomy literally means the second reading. The second reading. And in Deuteronomy, just before they enter the land, Moses begins to give a series of sermons over and over. And there's one word that comes up in the book of Deuteronomy more than any other. It's the word remember, where Moses says, remember, never forget God and what he did for you. And he recounts piece by piece what God did for this nation. Geographically, at this point, we find ourselves in what would be known now as modern-day Jordan, at a place called Mount Nebo. So you can see the green line where Moses and the Israelites have wandered, and they find themselves in that lower right, looks purple, doesn't it? Which is Mount Nebo. It's a fantastic place to stand on a clear day. You can see forever. And mostly what you can see is you look over the Dead Sea straight in front of you as you look west, and you'll see Jericho just off the side of it. There's a rough timeline I'll throw up is a bad way to say it, that I will toss up, but I will not go through. And you can look at that at your own leisure. And so we now enter into the book of Joshua. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, and now God The only thing he has not accomplished on their behalf is land. And this, of course, is what the book of Joshua is about. This is the 7th scene out of 11 scenes in Act number 2 of building a nation where God will now conquer the land. So, enough history. Now we get into Joshua himself. And we will read just the first 2 verses of Joshua. And then we'll do a little retrospective of his life on what we've seen so far in the Torah. Joshua 1:1 says this: After the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord said to Joshua, the son of Nun, Moses' assistant, Moses, my servant, is dead. Now therefore arise, go over this Jordan. It's kind of a weird comment. You and all this people into the land that I am giving to them, to the people of Israel. God is completing what he started when he plucked Abraham out of Ur. When he took a man who, by the way, was not Jewish, because there was no such thing as Jewish, and made him an Israelite. God is now completing what is missing, and this is where he points next. The name Joshua means Yahweh is salvation. What's fascinating is this is not his original name. His original name was Hosea. And Moses actually renames him in the book of Numbers in chapter 13 as well as in Deuteronomy 32. His original name meant salvation. And Moses changes it to Yahweh is salvation. And it's a forever reminder that over Joshua's life, that what happens, God is doing. See, it's so hard. We do so many things in our life. We're such active people. We can get very confused where the success came from, can't we? And we're the ones going to work. And we're the ones paying for the house, right? And we're the ones raising the kids. And then when the kids turn out halfway human, sometimes, then we go, quite a parent, right? And I love it. I'm looking at the older parents going, not at all, right? This is what God wanted to inflict into Joshua's life. What will be accomplished, I will accomplish. I want you to participate, but make no mistake about it. What's fascinating, too, about this is Moses had 2 sons, but apparently they were not worthy to carry out this torch, and so he chooses Joshua, Moses' apprentice. A quick, rough outline of the book of Joshua, and we'll be looking at only 3 of the 4 sections in our study. The first 6 weeks or so is literally just preparing to enter. It's amazing in these first 2 verses, God just says, all right, go get the land. And you think, wow, this should start right away. I'm going to preach for 7 weeks before Brian comes up in the 8th week and actually talks about conquering Jericho. That's a long time. I mean, 5 of the 24 chapters involve just being ready to enter this land. And we'll talk a lot about why that was so necessary. And then we'll go through just 6 or 7 ugly weeks of just war and skirmishes and battles and fascinating things entering into Canaan. And then they allocate the land. It's time for the tribes to actually get their piece of land. I'm only going to touch briefly on that in one half a sermon, if you will. And then the last 3 chapters are Joshua at the end of his life telling them what it will take to hold on to this dear land. The way the book ends, to me, is reason enough to want to look at what's within it. At the end of Joshua, Joshua says this, but as for me and my household, you can finish the sentence, I bet. We will serve the Lord. Good, good. But as for me and my household, this isn't at the beginning of his life. This isn't, 18-and-a-half-year-old Doug McBride who finally decides to follow God and is so exuberant, he's just calling pagan friends of his, telling them to put their beer down and start following Jesus, right? Where you're just dumb and excited, right? This is a guy at the end of his life saying this. This is a guy who had a hard life, never had a house, wandering, nomadic, running, moving, war after war after war, and infighting within the nation. What brought this kind of sold-out commitment to Joshua's heart? That he would say this at the end of his life, right? What did God do that Joshua watched that changed him this deeply? And then what we'll look at real quickly is, what did Joshua experience before we get to Joshua chapter 1, before he enters the land, that would bolster his faith in such a mighty way? You know, it's funny. If you pause, and each of you will be able to do this, I think, very rapidly, and maybe close your eyes, maybe not. We've got this ability. It's like panning for gold, and we have this ability. If you just pause and say, "Show me my life," to yourself, there will be these. Yeah, eyes are rolling in their head right now from up front here. I'm watching this. Just big boulders, right? You're sifting, and only the massive nuggets stick, not the day-to-day minutia. And this is the fascinating thing about life, because I make two different statements, particularly when I meet with guys, and they're both equally true and sound just the opposite. Life is actually made up of nondescript, just day-to-day, grinded-out things, right? You wake up and you decide to follow God. And you decide to remember you're blessed. There's nothing fancy about the day. You ever just brush your teeth in the morning going, "Holy cow, how many times have I done this?" There's almost a monotony to it sometimes, and you have to lift yourself. I think most of life is made up of that. But the other side is, life is also made up of these grand, huge moments that just etch your life. And when you shake that sifter, the big rocks just sit there. Joshua had these events in his life, and he had them even before you get to the book of Joshua. And oftentimes, like in our life, they can seem very random, very disconnected, very meaningless, quite frankly. Maybe even in the way. But that was not the case in this guy's life. Let me run through just 7 things that you see primarily in the book of Exodus about Joshua. And he's barely mentioned, but he's there. In Exodus 17, as the Israelites are still kind of heading out, they get out of Egypt and they're heading around and they're heading to Canaan. They're suddenly attacked by the Amalekites. The Amalekites were horrible people. I mean, they were barbaric and ruthless. This is the only incident in Joshua's life, by the way, where he has a battle outside the Promised Land, which means it's the only battle scene you will find Joshua in outside the book of Joshua. And coincidentally, the Amalekites clearly look like and have the upper hand. It's the scene, you remember, where Moses holds his arms up, and when his arms are up, they're winning, and when his arms go down, by the way, Joshua's leading the skirmish. You can imagine him as they start to lose, looking up like, "Dude, lift your arms up. I'm the one doing all the work down here. All you got to do is hold your stinking arms up." That's the scene, by the way. It's amazing that, and the Amalekites should win this battle, but they don't. And Joshua begins to see what it looks like when God overcomes overwhelming odds, which is the entire book of Joshua, by the way. In Exodus 24, when Moses is beginning to go up the mountain, meet with God, ride on stones, come back down, it goes on day after day, Joshua goes with him. The elders and Aaron go as well, but the elders and Aaron stop at a point, and he brings Joshua higher on the mountain than anybody, and then Joshua by himself. The elders get to sit together in Aaron, not Joshua. He's brought like 2/3, 3/4 of the way, and these are high mountains. I've done this once in my life in Sinai. There's all kinds of theory about which was the Sinai, but there's one where they really think it was, and you get up at 2 in the morning, and you climb this mountain to try to get up there. It takes 3-4 hours to climb it, with good hiking shoes, and then you watch the sunrise. Joshua sat on this mountain, and it's cold and windy by himself day after day. He would get a taste of what it meant to sit in the presence of God for the first time. In Exodus 32, while he's on that mountain, he begins to hear a shriek and a shriel and a party going on down below. He and Moses rush down with the elders and Aaron, him next to Moses, and what does he find? While God is speaking the Torah to Moses, they are being like harlots down below, melting earrings down with the golden calf. And by the way, and we don't have time to go into it, but it wasn't just melting the calf down. I mean, these are lewd sexual acts of worship and bloodshed. I mean, it is pagan what is going on. And he can hear those voices and that shrill going on. He begins to see for the first time what breaks God's heart. In Exodus 33, we find this scene where they would follow the pillar of cloud, around. Remember that God would lead them? When the pillar stopped, when God stopped, they would stop. And Moses would set a tent up just outside of camp. And Moses would sit at the tent and wait for the presence of God to show up. And in one small mention in Exodus 33, we learn Joshua went there every day with Moses. It's with no explanation as to why he was there. He's learning from his mentor Moses what it means to seek God every single day. In Numbers 11, the Spirit of God, rests on these two people that we never hear of again, Eldad and Medad. That should be a good Bible trivia pursuit question. And they start prophesying, and Joshua thinks they're out to lunch, so he stops them and he tells Moses, make these two people stop speaking. But it turns out it was the Spirit of God that rested on them, and they were prophesying on God's behalf. Joshua is starting to learn that he's fallible and makes mistakes. He's also learning that God will work in ways that don't necessarily make sense to him. And in Numbers 13, you'll remember this. It's time to take the land. Israel has not sinned yet, so it's not time to wander yet. So he sends spies out. Remember, there are 12 spies. And Caleb and Joshua, they go up, they see the land, and they go, wow, this is great. And they come back and give a great report. The other 10 spies go, not worth it. There's literal giants up there, the sons of Anak. They're massive. So 10 spies come back with one report. Caleb and Joshua come back with, yeah, we saw them, but who cares? God can do this. And they decide not to go. Joshua learns what it is to see the same thing that other people see and come to a completely different conclusion. So he has to begin to learn what it means to trust God and to stand completely alone at times. And in Numbers 27, Moses, at the end of his life, asks God to appoint a successor before he dies. And God tells him to lay his hands on Joshua and anoint him and commission him. Joshua is described from that point on as being one who possesses the Spirit of God. Wow, what a comment. Joshua learns it is only through the power of God that anything will take place when he conquers. One side note about these scenes in Joshua's life, before you get to the book of Joshua, you never see him by himself. Once. He is at Moses' side every second, with one exception, when he and Caleb went out together. This is how Joshua lived. There's mightily something to glean from this. If you're going through life and you don't have an older dude, or an older woman in your life, or 4, you are blowing it. How's that for blunt? And don't have brothers and sisters that know you almost better than you know yourself, you are missing it. Don't do it. Don't make that mistake. Each one of these instances were rough, to say the least, to go through for Joshua. And I might even say, like our difficulties, they seem random and disjointed in the way, maybe things that you would label in your life, or I have at the time, not good, frustrating. You can look at each one and they felt that way. Can you imagine what it would be like to be a shepherd guy? That's what Israel was. They were sheep herders. And now the Amalekites are coming at you. How frightening. Or how about being up on Mount Sinai? This is the mountain, by the way, where God met with Moses, that they put a fence around the bottom, because if you touched a rock on the mountain, you died. And Moses says to Joshua, come on, let's go. And Joshua steps over the fence and goes up on this mountain. How frightening. Or how about being on that mountain and hearing this just horrible party going on down below? And then listening to God and Moses back and forth, where God is so upset, he says, step out of the way, Moses. I will destroy Israel right here now. I'm done. I'm starting over with you. And Moses talking God out of it, literally. And Joshua watching this scene. How about sitting in a tent at the end of the day, every day, wondering if God would show up, wondering what God would say, wrestling over these people that prophesy in a strange way and you can't understand it, going up to this land and seeing the sons of Anak, these giants, and trying to figure out, looking at yourself, saying, how, God, on earth will you ever pull this off? Or how about, maybe worst of all, Moses goes on a small walk and never returns. The scriptures say that God buried Moses. You see, he didn't die next to Joshua. He disappeared. So Joshua sits, feeling the weight of on his shoulders of carrying this responsibility, thinking, how on earth will I ever live like this man Moses? Can you imagine that feeling? Some of you have parents like I do. You feel like that, like, how do I live up to this? Can you imagine how Joshua felt? These things can seem so disjointed, so random, but they're not. When you look at your sifter and you look at those big rocks in your life, if you have the ability to look back, as I mentioned, you can see that, I think, I hope. I look back as I was writing this sermon months ago, and just the rocks were showing up. You know, I started walking with God when I was 18 and a half. Right before that, I applied to get into Berkeley. My oldest sister went there, was a cheerleader there. She married one of the pitchers for Cal's baseball team. Then my next brother, Craig, went there. And then my brother, Jeff, went there. And then I got rejected. I was devastated in high school. And by the way, didn't deserve one moment of being at Berkeley at that point. But that didn't matter because I only had one plan and the plan wasn't working. But I needed to grow up. My wife and I got married when I was 22, a month after I graduated. She was my high school sweetheart. 6 months later, I just couldn't take it anymore because I'd already been teaching for 3 years in college, and Christian teaching, in other words. And so we started a youth group up. There were 2 high school kids, and I told the pastor, if you need a youth pastor, we'll do it on the side. I had a full-time job, and so we started it. The Furies joined us quickly after, and we quickly, within months, had 30 or so kids that were just coming in from the neighborhood. They weren't even church kids. And for the next 10 straight years, I put ministry before my wife. I remember coming into our bedroom on my knees, just crying and saying, I am so sorry. I'll never do this again. These are rocks, right? And I know you can see yours in your life. When we were 30, my wife's a little older than I am, so she was slightly older than 30. We sold our first house. We bought a piece of land. We built a house. No yard, no garage, no driveway, literally. Bare bones. And a year after we moved in, we were going under $1,000 a month. Talking to one another about how long before we sell this house. That we're still in, by the way. By amazing miracles. It was the same time at 30, by the way, when I was wrestling, like Jeremiah spoke about, with my own insides. I was such an approval addict. I was so afraid of people and being rejected. And so God basically had me step out of ministry for 4 years. I did not teach. In 1998, I went to work. I left the phone company and went to work for Brian. But unfortunately, I found out I wasn't really working for Brian. Brian and I were working for a bunch of just pagans that were terrible people. And 3 years later, the company still was losing money. And they began to just fire all the officers. And I was one of them. So here I was, 38 years old with no job, no income, and 2 kids. In my 40s, Brian and I started our company in 2001, and I was trying to remember, Brian, specifics on which time we almost lost our company, and there were so many I couldn't even remember which one was which. It was the same time, by the way, that my daughter contracted Lyme disease in high school. Hard, right? Just random junk, just bleh, just mud and debris coming off the side of a hill. I remember one last scene with my son. He was a good athlete, but he unfortunately was built with this body, and so he was not a massive man. And in fact, he was quite small. He hadn't really kicked into his 5'10" stature of today, and he had broken his foot and was barely coming back, and he was limping like crazy, but he wanted to play football. All right, he wanted to go out for football. And he went out for football, and I remember pulling my road bike up, and I hid. I was like the mom in the relationship in this one, and I hid behind a building at Monte Vista and watched. These towering guys, just so much bigger than him, and he would limp. He wasn't even past his foot being better. A week or so later, they had the first day of contact, and a big 250-pound freshman German guy by the name of Schmuckel broke his knee, and he never played again. I'll never forget sitting on my bike, watching my poor boy, right, trying to pull off what he couldn't pull off. There's scenes that do not leave the psyche. They're just mud. They're just mud. And here's what God does. He takes the mud and the debris that's just slop on the ground, and he makes a brick. And then he makes another brick and another one. And he places them, not randomly, just next to each other, side by side. And then you have a row of bricks. And then you have a wall of bricks. Only if, by the way, you lean into it. Only if you lean into it and stick with him. We cannot fade back in the midst of the mudslide. We have to stand there in it, saying this: the God of history is faithful and will make a brick out of this. And it doesn't look like much. If you look at a wall and it's one brick, it doesn't look like much. But a bunch of bricks placed right in the right spot by the creator of this universe is a wall and a house built on a foundation that cannot be stirred. I'll close and the worship band can come. In these famous set of verses in 1 Corinthians 4 that you know so well. The Apostle Paul, we are afflicted in every way but not crushed, perplexed, but not driven to despair, persecuted but not forsaken, struck down but not destroyed, always carrying, listen to this, in the body the death of Jesus. We don't think of ourselves that way, but that is what we are doing. We are in the mudslide carrying about the death of the body of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may also be manifested in our bodies. Notice it's also death and life side by side. The decay of this world and the dyingness of this body with the resurrection of Jesus coming out alongside it. For we who live are always being given over to death. That's an expectation, people. This side of heaven, you're in a mudslide. So if you say to yourself, why is this happening? You've really mixed up like what's supposed to happen. But we who live are always being given over to death for Jesus' sake, so that the life of Jesus also might be manifested in our mortal bodies. What a weird phrase. And it's mystical, and I don't even fully know how to describe it other than I know it in reality it works. Somehow the life of Jesus comes out when we experience the daily death of this world. I don't know how, but I know it as a reality. Amen? Let's pray. Father, we turn to you in this moment. You are not just the God of my day or my life. You are the God of Joshua. You are the God of Moses. This is our history. Not just the nuggets that sit in my sifter of my life. This is my life. This is my history. This is our history. And in that we claim your great faithfulness. We lay before you the mud and the debris of our life. Give us eyes to watch you make bricks of glory. In Jesus' name.